You're watching the Budget Byte 2014 on businessstandard.com as preparations get underway for the Union and the Rail budget to be presented. All eyes are on just what will be there in it for the infrastructure space to kickstart the stalled investment climate in the country. Remember, infrastructure has been one of the key selling planks of the Modi government campaign and also of the BJP manifesto. But will the new government, which has inherited a terrible economy, really be able to give a fillip to this sector? Joining me with his thoughts on the same and also his wish list is Manish Agarwal, Executive Director at PwC. Manish, let's in fact begin with the railway budget. There's been a lot of anticipation in what Modi does, particularly this time around, given those big announcements that he's made on the Diamond Quadrilateral and the bullet trains and so on. Is that a budget item, or do you see all of that evolving through the course of the next few years?
Yeah, Nikhil, I think it will be both. I expect that there will be significant mention of it in the budget. But in reality, I don't expect the high-speed rail projects to be funded largely out of the budget. A lot of that funding will be multilateral funding from agencies like JICA or World Bank or ADB or agencies like that. I think the budget will need to focus on let me call it the more mundane issues of revenue.
Sure.
There will be a lot of discussion, I guess, on fares. Mm-hmm. I would expect or want to see more discussion or more clarity on the regulator for railway fares, and that's been something that has been being talked about. But not just regulator as an institution, but more regulation as a more scientific way of determining fares. Will there be cost? How will fares reflect cost? What will be the cross-subsidy policy, so that the fare determination is not really a year-to-year exercise, but there is a certain degree of certainty to how railway fares will move forward.
Right.
This will certainly help freight users in terms of planning, whether they should be planning for rail or planning for road. It will also help any potential investors, because I imagine that PPP as a buzzword will be there somewhere in the discussion. But this will be quite critical for the private investment side also, to have a more certain revenue framework.
Right. Equally important, I think, is what the minister would say on many of those stalled railway projects. And we know, for instance, in the eastern part of the dedicated freight corridor and so on, there has been a lull in activity. Do you see any sort of language that would suggest, this government looking at expediting those projects?
Certainly, I think the whole the new government's kind of plank has been implementation.
Yeah.
I don't expect to see too many new ideas, nor is there need for new ideas. Mm-hmm. The need really is to put the existing ideas into implementation in a time-bound manner. Mm. So things like dedicated freight corridors, the funding is available. It's the execution that needs to get going.
Sure.
High-speed rail is going to be new, and I think I hope there will be rationality in terms of what can happen in what time frame. I mean, each high-speed rail project could be 80,000 crores, 100,000 crore kind of projects. So, these are projects that have a natural gestation period. Connectivity projects, particularly connectivity to ports, that is something that, can be done relatively faster and has huge impact on efficiency in, movement and on contributing to, manufacturing in India being competitive, which is the overall, goal towards job creation and so on.
Let's get to the broader infrastructure space, and particularly to highways now, because, that was in some sense seen as the big achievement of the Vajpayee era. But if you look at what's happened to highways now, they've been mired in problems of over leverage and stuck projects and, bank NPAs and so on. What sort of concrete measures do you see being announced to, sort of kickstart, in some sense, the road sector development in this country?
So first is to get the whole construction activity going. Start giving out EPC contracts. Yeah. That does not necessarily need to be a burden on the budget, because at a central government level, NHAI itself, through the cess fund, etc., has ability to fund a certain amount of projects and bring us back to 3,000 to 6,000 kilometers of awards a year.
Yeah.
That can happen only if the related point, which is projects that are stuck, that are not moving forward in the construction stage, whether EPC or PPP, for clearances, land acquisition, environment, etc., all of that needs to get removed.
Right.
Because only as that is removed, there is a fairly large amount of money that will get released, which can then come in through to the new EPC projects that I'm talking about.
Okay.
So these two is what I think is track one, and they are really not significantly dependent on the budget.
Right. But do you see a reworking of the entire sort of PPP space, which has been very problematic, not just in roads, but also in power and several other sort of segments of the infrastructure space being re-looked at in a more sort of pragmatic manner?
Absolutely. So that's what, while I said track one is get construction going and remove hurdles that are in existing projects, track two is the whole PPP stage. And I think that's where the budget has a strong role to play in terms of giving clarity on how will the banks, which have huge exposures to road projects and power projects, how will they effectively get bailed out? The budget is not the right place to say how the PPP model will be different.
Yeah.
But I expect they might use it to say what is institutionally going to be done to revisit the PPP models, and to, for the new set of PPP approach to be less risky, more aligned to infrastructure funds, more aligned to low risk, steady return kind of cash flows.
Sure.
So the institutional approach to reworking PPPs, I would expect the budget to say something on that.
All right. I just want to draw your attention to the sort of big manifesto, items, including, this sort of dream of building 100 new cities. Then there's laying a national optical fiber network, setting up gas grids, modernizing and building existing and new airports. They want to sort of also expedite work on the freight corridors and so on. These are sort of things that need to go sort of move beyond just promises, right? So do you expect the budget to lay out any concrete roadmap to put these sort of things into action?
I think urbanization is certainly going to be a very central theme. It has been, and it needs to be, and it's certainly been a very central theme of whatever the BJP and the Modi campaign has been focused on. I think urbanization will need to work at two levels. One is really on existing cities, probably a new avatar of JNNURM, quite likely. I would expect a lot more focus on housing.
Sure.
The other part is the new cities. Now, the level of readiness on that at one level is fairly high. So the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor with 7 new cities, fairly detailed level of planning already done. Chennai-Bangalore Industrial Corridor, another 3 to 5, kind of new nodes for development, again in some, kind of fairly advanced stage of planning. Then the whole Kolkata, Vizag, Chennai, Tuticorin corridor, early stages, but, again on the radar, and then the Amritsar and so on. So, the level of readiness varies. What one needs to recognize is that new cities development is a fairly long process. Even when you've got things in, what the actual shift of people, etc., takes time, and the infrastructure needs to be put in ahead of demand. I think if this budget starts giving some clarity on how will long-term funding,
the funding aspect,
30-year kind of funds become available, particularly for city development. It could be things like, future revenues or future tax revenues in these cities being pledged, and that enables, long-term funding. So tax increment financing is an instrument that has been used, in various parts of the world. Or
some measures to sort of reduce the asset liability mismatches in the country.
Absolutely.
But, any sort of specific fiscal incentives, for instance, tax holidays or, changes in the existing SEZ norms that could come about to spur infrastructure growth as well?
I think my sense is that the focus will be more on creating tax certainty than necessarily about tax concessions.
Okay.
Again, having seen Gujarat quite closely, I think the whole pitch is not so much around tax concessions. It's about good governance, quick clearances, streamlined processes. Having said that, I think there will be some bit of revisiting of SEZ policy and IMZ policy because making manufacturing competitive in the country is very central to the job creation and 25% share of manufacturing in GDP kind of targets that the national manufacturing policy sets out. and I think everybody's fairly aligned to that, so one could see a little bit on that.
Yeah, you mentioned the ease of doing business, and everybody says that it's incumbent upon this government, if it wants to sort of spur infrastructure activity, to take a relook at the land acquisition legislation. So, are you expecting something to come up on that front?
I don't think the budget is the right place for that. So even if there is some mention, it is really a legislative issue. It's an act. If the act has to be amended, it has to be taken through a different process. I do see indications on the rest of ease of doing business.
Yeah.
The clearance processes, the approvals processes. I think there will probably be some bit of guidance on how those things will flow out. And there have been several things that have been in the works, which can be kind of put together and really rolled out to make it easier to have a single window experience, even if it is not really a single window, but as an experience that is as similar to a single window as it can get.
All right, Manish. Thanks so much for talking to BizStander.